Hi everyone, Michael Smith here. If you're familiar with my work through my books or other videos, you'll know that it's all based on a vibrational pattern I discovered some years ago, what I call the prime vibration. This is the double helix pattern which emerges when reality is viewed in its most fundamental form, as cycles of prime numbers in base 12. In previous videos, I show how this deceivingly simple waveform seems to be a universal manifestation blueprint of how thoughts turn into things, and perhaps the geometry of consciousness itself. It offers compelling explanations as to why numerology and the law of attraction work so well, and why certain geometric shapes and ratios are so fundamental to nature, such as the circle and its defining ratio pi, the double helix of DNA, and the golden ratio of fractal growth. It also suggests that what drives it all is the vibrational dynamic of love gaining self-awareness. In this video, we're going to get a little more technical. We will attempt to fill in the scientific gap between theory and actual, between thoughts and things, by exploring how the physical universe and everything in it could indeed emerge from the prime vibration. Now I know that sounds like an incredibly naive and futile exercise, especially how complicated nature is. However, you'll be surprised just how simple nature actually is when viewed through the lens of the prime vibration. You'll see how it works as a fundamental probability cycle of 12 quantum states, a visually elegant and mathematically precise geometry that operates the same way at all scales of nature, from the subatomic to the cosmic and everything in between. The prime vibrational model not only seems to agree with well-established facts about how the universe works, but also suggests some pretty fascinating explanations for a range of unsolved mysteries and open questions in physics, of which there are many, this list highlighting the biggies, such as the true nature of the Big Bang and whether our universe is the only one, dark energy and why space expands, dark matter and how galaxies form, black holes and their purpose, the matter-antimatter asymmetry which led to the excess of matter including stars, planets, and fortunately us, subatomic and atomic structure and the fundamental forces of nature, the Higgs field and how particles get their mass, and the first ever theoretical prediction that I'm aware of anyway, of all the properties of the subatomic particles including their electrical charge, spin, and mass. Also why the speed of light is what it is and what time is itself. And last but not least, why mathematics seems to describe nature so well and how consciousness fits into everything. By the end of this video, the prime vibration will suggest answers to all of these questions and more, answers which are explained in detail in my book, The Prime Vibration, if you want a closer look. Now, although you won't need advanced knowledge of math or physics to follow along, we do get into some math and physics concepts out of necessity, especially geometry. However, I explain everything as we go and use a lot of visuals to help. So, with that little disclaimer, get comfortable with a nice cup of coffee or tea, or an even stiffer drink, depending on your needs, and I hope you enjoy the video. Let's begin with what the base 12 prime vibration is. In short, it's the simplest and most efficient way for reality to emerge from nothing. Here's a summary of how that emergence happens from one dimension to the next. First, we start with a zero-dimensional point as the simplest conceptual way for reality to exist, to differentiate existence from non-existence and something from nothing. As such, a point is the neutral origin and literal starting point for anything further. The idea of neutrality is therefore the first inherent fundamental property of reality. Next, the simplest expression of that point beyond itself is a one-dimensional line propagating outward. However, to retain the neutrality of the point as its origin, that line must be expressed in both the positive and negative directions to preserve that neutrality overall. This manifests the principle of polarity, of positive and negative and neutral balance as the next fundamental property of reality. And in mathematical terms, this generates the real number line, the simplest expression of which goes from 0 to 1 and -1. In turn, the simplest neutral expression of that line centered on the origin is of all possible rotations of the line about the origin, which is a 2D circle centered about the origin. This creates a second spatial dimension perpendicular to the real number line and the principle of rotation as our next fundamental property of reality. Mathematically, this is the unit circle, a circle of radius 1 centered about the origin. Now, because the real number line represents the fundamental axis of reality, it's only the 2 points on the circle which cross the real number line, at 1 and -1, at which the circle can essentially manifest as real points or particles, so to speak. All other points around the circle which don't touch the real axis are therefore non-real potentials. The simplest mathematical expression of such a unit circle, consisting of real and non-real coordinates, is what is inappropriately called the complex unit circle, because it's not complex at all. Here, every point is defined by a horizontal real number coordinate and a vertical imaginary number coordinate, I, which together represent a complex number. But there's a special relationship between imaginary and real numbers in that they can transform into each other through rotation. This is defined by the expression I squared equals -1, such that multiplying an imaginary number I by itself rotates it 90 degrees onto the real number line, depicted here by the green arrow. Likewise, multiplying a real number by I rotates it onto the imaginary axis. In other words, imaginary probabilities become real manifestations and do so through circular rotation about the origin as a neutral point of reference. Now, because the unit circle in the complex plane crosses the horizontal real number line at the 2 points 1 and -1, and the vertical imaginary number line at the 2 points I and -I, this creates a number cycle consisting of 4 points, what's called the base 4 cycle in mathematics. As such, this introduces the principle of cycle as the next fundamental property of reality. Although the base 4 cycle is a very efficient description of reality thus far, of positive, negative, and imaginary real polarity and neutral balance, it's also very limited. It can only divide the circle essentially in 2 ways, in half or in quarters. It turns out that the base 12 cycle offers the best compromise between efficiency and versatility of 5 ways of expressing itself, in half and in quarters like base 4, but also in thirds, sixths, and twelfths. Indeed, throughout nature we find base 12 at work, from lunar cycles to snowflakes, chemistry, and even subatomic structure. Next, because every integer is either a prime number that can't be divided further, such as 2, 3, or 5, or a product of primes, such as 4 equals 2 times 2, 6 equals 2 times 3, and so on, all we need to fully describe the base 12 cycle are the positions where prime numbers can occur, and these end up being positions 1, 5, 7, and 11. And because these 4 prime positions are equivalent to vectors of length equal to their number values and pointing away from the origin, any pair that's opposite each other subtracts to a single vector of their net length. As such, vectors 7 and 1 reduce to a new vector of length 6 at position 7, while vectors 11 and 5 reduce to a new vector also of length 6 at position 11. Thus, the base 12 cycle can be fully described by prime positions 7 and 11 alone, and therefore represents the simplest way of describing reality in terms of a cycle. Now, the simplest neutral expression of the base 12 prime cycle is that of amplitude, its vertical imaginary coordinate, and depth, its horizontal real coordinate, over time. A double sine wave vibration in 2D, and which is a double helix standing wave in 3D, if we could also see its rotation into the page. This then introduces the principle of vibration as the next fundamental property of reality. And because the prime vibration is generated by the base 12 cycle, specifically prime positions 7 and 11, it's comprised of a cycle of 12 quantum geometries corresponding to the 12 rotational orientations of those 2 positions as probability boundaries. And where those boundaries intersect the real axis is where prime numbers can manifest, again at positions 1, 5, 7, and 11. This idea of probabilities behaving both as waves and particles, wave-particle duality, is in fact a foundational property of modern physics, though its underlying mechanism has remained a mystery. Finally, as the prime vibration represents one complete experiential cycle, and since every subsequent cycle passes through the same intersection point at position 6, all infinitely many possible experiences would form the 3D shape of a torus, the recirculating and reinforming principle of self-reference. As such, the torus represents the total probability space of all past experiences and all future potentials relative to the self at position 6. Essentially, the present moment's self-awareness and informational dynamic of consciousness itself. This might explain why matter at all fractals of scale tends to assume this toroidal shape, from atoms to red blood cells, the human brain, the biofield, magnetic fields, solar systems, spiral galaxies, and perhaps even the universe multiverse itself, and that all such fractals are conscious to some degree. Now, based on the 6-step process of geometric emergence we just walked through, from point to line, circle, cycle, vibration, and finally torus, we see that 6 fundamental properties of reality are intrinsic to that emergence: neutrality, polarity, rotation, cycle, vibration, and self-reference. Each principle builds upon the previous in a cumulative way, adding greater complexity and a higher dimensional perspective each step of the way. This, I suggest, is why nature is capable of such great complexity through great simplicity, and why consciousness is the ultimate and inevitable expression of that complexity. Something important to note about the last 3 steps of emergence, cycle, vibration, and self-reference, is that they represent 3 different axes of rotation. Where a cycle is vertical rotation about the real number line, into the page so to speak, vibration is lateral rotation sideways, and the torus is horizontal rotation like a spinning top. This means that the prime vibration represents 3-dimensional spherical rotation. And because we're dealing with complex numbers as rotational coordinates, we need to use the higher dimensional version of complex numbers called quaternions. Where the single-axis rotation of our base 12 cycle could be described by 2D complex numbers consisting of one imaginary coordinate plus the real, the 3-axis rotation of the prime vibration requires 4-dimensional complex numbers with 3 imaginary coordinates plus the real. Now, just from what we've covered so far, we're already sketching in a few potential answers to our open questions. That math, and base 12 in particular, describe nature so well because the prime vibration emerges from prime numbers and the base 12 number cycle in the first place, and does so through geometry. That wave-particle duality is a fundamental property of nature because the prime vibration represents that very geometry of a figure-8 standing wave probability boundary crossing the real axis at literal intersection points. That consciousness fits into everything because everything is conscious, with every manifestation cycle following the figure-8 self-aware dynamic of the prime vibration, and of all experiences referencing back to that point of self, position 6, through the torus dynamic of cumulative consciousness, and thus of memory too, and also explaining why the torus shape occurs so often in nature. So let's examine our prime vibrational model a little more closely to see what other questions it might answer. First, we began with the base 12 prime cycle as the simplest and most versatile geometric form that reality would logically take. This automatically established neutrality, polarity, rotation, and cycle as necessary fundamental properties of nature. When the base 12 prime cycle was then expressed over 2D imaginary and real space of the complex plane and over time, the double helix prime vibration emerged as a 3D rotational object in 4D quaternion space. This added the property of vibration to nature's basic recipe, and also established position 6 as the central point of reference for that vibration. Next, in order for this construct to be perceivable, it required an observer's frame of reference aligned with the real axis. This projects as a 2D figure-8 standing wave intersecting at position 6, and with 12 quantum states defined by the 3 geometric properties of amplitude, polarity, and spin. However, only the up and down directions of spin are perceivable, not the full rotational spin into the page, due to our limited front view perspective. This curious up or down spin is something quantum experiments has confirmed for the 12 fermion particles of matter, suggesting that those particles indeed represent the 12 quantum positions on the solid black wave shown as black dots, and therefore the 12 white dots on the dashed wave being their antimatter counterparts. Again, the 2D figure 8 prime vibration represents one complete experiential cycle of probability relative to position 6 as its point of reference, and relative to the neutral reality axis where reality manifests. Also, due to its polarized structure and inherent overall neutrality, the prime vibration shape takes on an elegant left-right symmetry relative to position 6, resembling butterfly wings, but an up-down asymmetry relative to the neutral reality axis, such that the tips of the wings at 0 and 12 rise above the reality axis, while position 6 falls below. This creates 4 quadrants of equal area, 2 of positive probability, shaded light gray, and 2 of negative probability, shaded light blue, and with a probability gap over position 6. This would not only explain the existence of matter and antimatter opposite in polarity or charge, but otherwise identical, but also the reason for black holes. That's because in its final stage of emergence, all possible cycles of the prime vibration would form an endless toroidal flow recirculating through position 6. So, what begins as a 1D probability gap over position 6 in 2D becomes a 2D circular black hole in 3D. This suggests that black holes are not only a necessary feature of nature, but also conceal within them the true nature of position 6, as a polarity reversal between 2 opposite half cycles. Basically, if you twisted a rubber band by 360 degrees, position 6 is the 180-degree point in the middle where the 2 bands cross. This in turn suggests that our universe isn't the only one, but one of infinitely many half cycles of a dual universe cycle, which unfortunately also means that the half cycle we are currently in will eventually come to an end. The good news, however, is that it won't happen for a long time, because, as we will soon see in the cosmological story, we are only about halfway through the book we're currently reading. Even better news is that if everything, including us, is indeed consciousness that survives and gets wiser from one cycle to the next, then we ultimately don't have anything to worry about, do we? Now, the idea of a torus-shaped universe isn't as odd as it sounds. It's actually supported by a major finding in string theory that 4D spacetime, including gravity, can emerge holographically like a torus from the surface of a 3D quantum particle system, just like our prime double helix here. Called the ADS-CFT correspondence, without getting into the details, this 1997 result by the physicist Juan Maldacena only applies to a finite bounded universe with a negatively curved saddle-like shape, such as the interior of a torus. The challenge with this is that our universe seems to have the opposite type of shape, a positively curved, infinitely expanding one. However, as we will see shortly, what we perceive as linear outward expansion may indeed be just an illusion of the twisting rotation of the prime vibration. With that preamble, let's now complete our picture of how the prime vibration plays out at each scale of nature. To do this, we will basically fill in the following chart as we go from smallest to largest, from the subatomic to the atomic, stellar, galactic, and finally universal. And in so doing, we'll attempt to fill in the rest of our blanks in the list of open questions. To explain what happens at the subatomic scale, or any scale for that matter, we can simply look at how the geometry of the prime vibration changes over each of the 12 stages of the cycle. To help with that, here's the 12 rotational increments of the base 12 cycle which create that geometry. Remember, this base 12 cycle represents the side view of the prime vibration, its spin into the page that's otherwise hidden from our view. So far, we've been describing the base 12 cycle and the prime vibration in very conceptual terms, as a cycle of 12 numbered positions from 0 to 11, and with a vibrational amplitude from 6 to -6. Once we describe them in terms of what they specifically represent, as complex number rotations and probabilities, These three scales of height, width, and spin into the page reveal their true nature. To explain, let's revisit the topic of complex numbers. We saw earlier how multiplying by powers of the imaginary number I causes rotations around the complex unit circle, and does so in 4 90-degree increments, that is, according to the base 4 cycle. It works a similar way for spherical rotations in quaternion space, the 4D space in which the prime double helix resides. Again, in base 4, there's 4 rotational increments, each one equivalent to a higher power of I. That is, starting from I to the 0 equals 1, to I to the power 1 equals I, to I squared equals minus 1, the defining property of imaginary numbers themselves, then to I cubed equals minus I, and finally I to the power of 4 equals 1, getting us back to the start of the cycle. The base 12 cycle, on the other hand, has 12 rotational increments and therefore rotates through powers from 0 to 11 before returning back to the start of the cycle. Also, whereas the complex unit circle has a defining value of I, essentially its radius as a vector, to which the powers apply, the base 12 cycle has a defining value of 12, its maximum length as a vector at position 12, and thus follows powers of 12. However, quaternion rotation involves what's called a double-sided transformation, which essentially means 2 equal half rotations of 180 degrees relative to a fixed central origin. As that central origin of the prime vibration is position 6, the base 12 quaternion cycle goes from 12 to the 0 to 12 to the power 6 and back again to 12 to the 0. This therefore defines the scale of the horizontal axis of our prime vibration, a logarithmic positional scale which achieves its maximum at position 6 in the center of the waveform and its minimum at the outermost positions of 0 and 12, oscillating back and forth as a standing wave. In addition to this positional scale along the horizontal axis, the 3D prime double helix operates in 2 other directions, vertically and into the page. The vertical axis measures the amplitude of the prime vibration, which is from 6 to minus 6, as well as its polarity relative to the neutral axis, which is positive, negative, and or neutral, while the perpendicular axis of our line of sight into the page, so to speak, measures its depth of spin towards us or away, again from 6 to minus 6. However, because the vertical axis represents probability, its full range must equal 100% or 1. As such, we can restate the vertical scale as going from 0.5 to minus 0.5 in terms of probability, rather than from 6 to minus 6 in terms of amplitude. Because the axis into the page represents spin, it follows a base 12 power cycle similar to that of our horizontal axis. However, where the horizontal axis represents the 12 positions within a single wavelength of the base 12 cycle, and thus follows powers of 12, the spin axis represents complete cycles and therefore follows powers of 10, where 10 in base 12 equals 1 complete cycle of 12. The spin cycle nevertheless follows the same double-sided transformation rule for quaternion rotation as does the positional cycle, which means it goes from 10 to the 0 to 10 to the 6 and back to 10 to the 0. This would explain why so many phenomena in nature follow a logarithmic scale, from light to color to sound and the golden ratio of fractal growth, and even the gap between the fractals of nature themselves. And not just any logarithmic gap, but the full 10 to the power 11 of our base 12 spin cycle, when viewed as a linear scale from 0 to 11, rather than a rotational one from 0 to 6 and back again. In other words, the prime vibration inherently manifests every 10 to the power 11 or 100 billion of each smaller fractal of itself, and does so in its signature torus form. There are that many atoms in a DNA molecule, about that many red blood cells in a newborn infant, neurons in the human brain, stars in a mature galaxy, and galaxies in the observable universe. Together, these 3 geometric properties define the 3D shape and motion of the prime vibration relative to the neutral reality axis, the manifestation line on which imaginary potentials become real particles of matter. As such, these properties describe the vibrational geometry of each of the 12 quantum positions within the prime vibration. It turns out that these are the very same three properties that define subatomic particles in quantum mechanics: probability amplitude as mass, polarity as electrical charge, and spin as angular momentum. The big difference is that these were determined through experimental observation, whereas the prime vibration seems to predict them. This enables us to fill in the first row of our table with those 12 geometric descriptions. Beginning with position 0 with a plus 0.25 amplitude above the real axis, but as a point probability, not a range, and with a spin direction fully away from us. Then position 1 with a positive amplitude of sine 60 degrees times 0.5, but touching the neutral real axis, thus a polarity ratio of +1 to 0, and with a spin mostly away, partly down. Next, position 2 with its amplitude partially above and below the real axis of positive 0.5 and a negative 0.25 for a polarity ratio of +2 to -1, and a spin mostly down, partly away now. Then position 3 with its amplitude maxed out and equally split above and below the real axis for a balanced polarity ratio of +1 to -1, and a spin fully downward. Then position 4 with a plus 0.25 and minus 0.5 amplitude, and thus a +1 to -2 polarity, and a spin mostly down, partly towards us. Next, position 5 with a negative amplitude of sine 60 times 0.5, but touching the real axis, for a 0 to -1 polarity, and a spin mostly toward, partly down. Then the all-important position 6, as the intersection point between the two prime waves, and a point of neutrality where opposite polarities cancel, and at an amplitude of -0.25 hidden below the real axis, but with a spin fully towards us. Again, all of which describes the subjective quality of love in a geometric way. Then, on to position 7, which, like position 5, has a minus sine 60 times 0.5 amplitude touching the real axis, and thus a 0 to -1 polarity, but with a spin mostly towards us, partly up. Then position 8, which, like position 4, has a plus 0.25 minus 0.5 amplitude, and thus a +1 to -2 polarity, but with a spin mostly up, partly towards us. Then position 9, which, like position 3, has its amplitude maxed out and equally split above and below for a polarity ratio of +1 to -1, but now with a spin fully up rather than fully down. Then position 10, which, like position 2, has a +5 to -0.25 amplitude, and thus a +2 to -1 polarity ratio, but with a spin mostly up, partly away. And last but not least, position 11, which, like position 1, has an amplitude of plus sine 60 times 0.5 touching the real axis, and thus a polarity ratio of +1 to 0, but with a spin mostly away, partly up. The matter portion of the cycle now complete, that being the solid prime wave traveling left to right from 0 to 11, the cycle reverses at position 12 for the 12 antimatter particles, which is represented by the das prime wave traveling right to left from 11 to 0. This again illustrates how matter and antimatter are created equally to maintain neutrality overall, but also implies the forward-backward nature of time. That is, for reality to be perceived by an observer, that observer must presumably be of the same polarity of probability, either matter or antimatter. Therefore, we as observers who matter, pun intended, can only perceive the portion of the prime vibration relating to matter, that being the solid prime wave traveling from left to right. As such, our perception of physical experience must also play out in a linear way along that seemingly forward arrow of time. This in turn suggests that not only time is an illusion, but also space. From the point of perspective of the prime vibration, that of position 6, there is only the now moment. So, for that timeless and neutral point of reference to become self-aware, but still retain its neutrality, it can only do so in a polarized way as a thought form beyond itself, which it can experience as real and reintegrate as information. This, I suggest, is the true nature of reality and of consciousness itself. Everything exists only in the present moment, with the past and the future both figments of that highly convincing arrow of time. And because consciousness has a cumulative memory to it, all acquired experiences feel like they occurred previously, only reinforcing a sense of past. Nevertheless, that illusion of time through space has a seemingly very real pace to it, a universal speed limit that all energy and matter is subject to, that being the speed of light. Still, when we look from the perspective of position 6, that of the neutral intersection between two polarized timelines, and of a 12 to the 6 potential waiting to be expressed, we perhaps see what the speed of light actually represents. Because the energetic range of the prime vibration is from 12 to the 6 at position 6 to 12 to the 0 at position 0 and 12, this, I suggest, is its energetic reach in going from a pure potential at rest to being fully liberated as kinetic energy in motion. After all, that's what Einstein's theory of relativity essentially proves, that the closer we get to the speed of light, the more slowly time passes. But to actually get there, we would need to be massless like a photon of light. Speaking of which, I believe this is also why time seems to stand still, and everything seems possible when we're in love or doing things we love. We are essentially resonating with the vibrational geometry of love itself, and with the 12 to the power 6 potential and timeless geometry of position 6, that of light itself. As such, to me, 12 to the 6 is synonymous with the speed of light, but only when expressed in the logarithmic dimensions of the prime vibration, which is basically cycles of base 12 cycles. So, to express it in terms of the physical units we experience, of distance over time or meters per second, we essentially need to multiply it by 10 to 10 squared to convert cycles of cycles to individual units of speed. When we do so, we get 12 to the 6 times 10 to the 2, which equals 298,598,400, which happens to be just 0.4 of 1% off of our actual measured speed of light of 299,792,458 meters per second. Granted, this does assume that meters and seconds are the fundamental units of space and time, but this is a fair assumption since both are derived from natural cycles. Also, the possible reason for that slight discrepancy we'll cover when we talk about the cosmic scale. But returning to our task at hand, we'll now determine the properties of all the subatomic particles of matter. Based on those properties and their position within the prime vibration, we can then see if they agree with the actual particles observed in quantum experiments. First, let's talk about spin. Because the spin of the prime vibration creates a figure-8 pattern, any position on that figure-8 boundary has to complete two 360-degree rotations to get back to its original position for a total of 720 degrees. Again, that's because the vibration as a standing wave oscillation consists of a full matter cycle from left to right and then antimatter cycle from right to left. In physics terms, that means any position on either prime wave has a spin of 1/2. As there are exactly 12 fermion particles known to exist and 12 antimatter particles, all with a spin of 1/2, this seems to confirm that every position in the prime cycle indeed corresponds to a specific fermion particle. Also, based on what's called the Pauli exclusion principle, no two fermions can occupy the same quantum state. In other words, only one unique particle to each of the 12 matter positions, and same goes for the 12 antimatter positions. Now, position 6 is special because it not only represents spin 1/2 positions on the two individual prime waves, but also the intersection between both prime waves, and therefore a still point where the opposing waves cancel out. Position 6 as an intersection and polarity reversal therefore has a spin of 0, and the only known particle which has such a spin is the Higgs boson, the particle discovered in 2012 and famously dubbed the God particle, and the particle expression of the Higgs field, which has the central role of imparting mass to all the other particles. So now that we know the Higgs definitely belongs at position 6, let's move on to determine which fermion goes where based on its mass, or probability amplitude, and its electrical charge, or polarity ratio, of that amplitude relative to the neutral real axis. Now, because position 6 represents the ground state and energetic reference for the entire prime vibration, its probability geometry presumably sets the electrical charges too. And because position 6 is the fixed center of the waveform, it represents a simple circular rotation about the origin, while all other positions are spherical rotations off to one side or the other relative to position 6. That means it follows the 90-degree rotation rule of the complex unit circle, and thus of two perpendicular angles of perspective. One of looking straight on to the vertical imaginary axis I, and the other looking down from above to the horizontal real axis of I squared equals -1. So the imaginary axis perspective is that of the prime vibration as shown, of its front view projection. From this vantage, we see that at position 6, the imaginary axis extends 2/3 above the polarity reversal, the little blue arrow, and 1/3 below, the area shaded gray. As probabilities must always total 100% or 1, this implies that the front view probabilities follow a charge ratio of +2/3 and -1/3. And any particles subject to those probabilities must do so as well. And when we apply these charges to the 4 quadrants of the prime vibration, we get the arrangement as shown. But from the top-down perspective, we get a different view, that of the blue arrow extending the full width of the circle with no view of the oppositely charged gray area below. Because this 90-degree rotated view induces the negative sign of I squared equals -1, the only possible charge ratio, which still adds to 100% probability, is -1 and 0. Thus, any particles subject to these probabilities have charges of -1 or are neutral with 0 charge. As this plane is rotated 90 degrees into the page, the 4 quadrants are hidden from view but otherwise identical to the front view pattern. This offers a beautifully simple explanation for not only the subatomic charges of nature, but also for the electromagnetic force itself, and why magnetic and electric fields are perpendicular to each other. As such, we can treat our front view as the magnetic plane and the top view as the electric plane, which makes sense as the front view has polarized charges of both positive and negative, while the top view plane has strictly unit electric charge or none at all. Now, as to which positions get which electrical charge. First, because the prime vibration has a left-right symmetry and must preserve neutrality overall, we can assume that all the electrical charges are distributed in a balanced way across the 12 particle positions and according to the polarity of the 4 probability areas. That is, 3 particles per each of the 4 charge types, grouped in pairs according to which plane they occur in. For the +2/3 and -1/3 charges of the magnetic plane, that means there would be 3 particles with a +2/3 charge in the upper left quadrant of position 0 to 5, the 3 positive quarks, and their 3 -1/3 charged counterparts in the lower right quadrant of position 6 to 11, the 3 negative quarks. Likewise, for the -1 and 0 charges of the electric plane, there would be 3 -1 charged particles in the rotated upper left quadrant, the 3 charged leptons, and their 3 neutral counterparts in the rotated lower right quadrant, the 3 neutral neutrinos. Further, the antiparticles of these 12 matter particles would be in the oppositely charged but otherwise identical quadrants, the upper right and lower left shaded in light blue. And now that we have the general placements of the 12 fermions according to charge, we will assign them specific positions based on their probability profiles, starting with the 3 +2/3 charged quarks in the upper left quadrant. Here's all of the completed assignments so that you can follow along. Since all probabilities, and therefore mass, reference back to the geometry of the Higgs at position 6, that of the horizontal blue arrow, its full expression would be that of a 90-degree rotation to the vertical, again the I squared equals -1 rule of transforming imaginary probabilities into real matter. This puts the most massive positive quark, the top quark, at position 3, the only position with that fully projected vertical geometry. As the other two positive quarks must be less massive, the charm quark and the up quark, they must be even further away from the Higgs at position 6. Neither can be at position 0, being a point probability above the real axis, and thus another 90-degree rotation back to the horizontal imaginary axis of the electrical plane. Therefore, the lightest of the two, the up quark, would be outermost at position 1, and the middleweight charm quark at position 2. Now, because the geometry of position 6 shows the plus 2/3 and minus 1/3 zones to be 180 degrees opposite each other, that is, plus 2/3 above and minus 1/3 below, that means that each of the three negative quarks are 180 degrees away from their positive counterparts. Thus, the up quark at position 1 puts the down quark at position 7, the charm quark at 2 puts the strange quark at 8, and the top quark at 3 puts the bottom quark at 9. These pairings make intuitive sense too, simply based on their matching geometry in oppositely charged quadrants. Next, let's assign positions to the three -1 charge leptons and their neutral counterparts, the three neutrinos. As mentioned, the -1 charged particles would be in the upper left quadrant, rotated back 90 degrees, and the neutrinos in the lower right quadrant, also rotated back. And like the quarks, the -1 charged leptons come in three masses, from lightest to heaviest. These are the electron, the muon, and the tau. Based on the same reasoning as above, the lightest would be furthest away from the influence of the Higgs at position 6, putting the electron at position 0, the heavyweight tau closest to the Higgs at position 5, and the middleweight muon at the only remaining position 4 in between. This just leaves the three neutrinos to find homes for in the lower right quadrant, within which only three available positions remain. Position 6 on the solid prime wave rotated back, not to be confused with the Higgs as the unrotated intersection of both waves, as well as positions 10 and 11. Because all three of these positions fall on or below the neutral reality axis, they have zero charge in the rotated back electrical plane, as they must in order to be neutral neutrinos. In order of lightest to heaviest, this places the electron neutrino at position 11, being furthest from the Higgs, the middleweight muon neutrino at position 10, and the heavyweight tau neutrino at position 6, again on a single prime wave. This now accounts for all the particles with mass, the 12 fermions, as well as the source of the Higgs field which imparts mass to those particles. This therefore seems to confirm that the 12 fermions found so far accounts for all of them, and that the Higgs field is indeed what feeds them. And while we're on the heavy topic of mass, why does each particle have the specific mass it does, as measured in experiments? This remains one of the biggest mysteries of particle physics, although it's well established that the Higgs field is indeed what facilitates those masses, and that each particle represents an excitation of that field. How to predict those masses has remained elusive. The prime vibration, however, seems to offer a way through. Recall when I said that the prime vibration is a three-dimensional rotational object in 4D quaternion space, the higher dimensional version of the 2D complex plane, and that each of the 12 quantum geometries represents a spherical rotation of a point with three imaginary coordinates. Let's call them I, j, and k. Well, in the math of quaternions, the product of those three imaginary coordinates rotates that point onto the real number line as a real physical particle, so to speak. That is, I times j times k equals -1 with 3D spherical rotations, just as I times I equals -1 did with 2D circular rotations. This is nothing new in the math and physics arena, but what is new is that the prime vibration seems to reveal what those three imaginary coordinates represent in 3D and what their projected values are in the 2D space-time plane we perceive. It turns out they are the very properties which define any quantum particle: its probability as an amplitude, its electrical charge as a polarity, and its spin as an angular momentum. but also its base 12 position, all of which is captured by the three axes of the prime vibration. Its vertical axis of probability amplitude and the polarity of that amplitude above and or below the real axis, its horizontal axis of base 12 position as a power of 12, and its perpendicular axis of spin into the page as a power of 10. What this means is that we can calculate the probability of each of the 12 fermions directly using the basic formula of ijk equals -1 of polarized amplitude times base 12 position times spin equals probability. And because this is the probability projected into the 2D plane we perceive, the I squared equals -1 rule for 2D complex rotations tells us that mass squared equals probability, or equivalently that mass equals the square root of probability. So in contrast to our typical interpretation of the I squared part as being imaginary and -1 as being real, the prime vibration implies that mass is imaginary and only probabilities are real, which is, at the end of the day, all that quantum mechanics actually says. Also, because the 6 lower fermions on the right side of the prime vibration are related to their 6 upper fermion partners on the left side by a 180 degree rotation, or 6 positions, there's a further equality that lower probability squared equals upper probability, or equivalently that lower probability equals the square root of upper probability. Thus, once we have the probabilities of the upper particles, we can take the square root to get the lower ones, to which we can then apply the lower particle's spin factor. And knowing the lower particle's probability, we can once again take its square root to get its mass. Now, because particle masses are typically expressed in terms of mega electron volts over the speed of light squared, the masses given by the prime vibration would need to be converted into the same units in order to compare them apples to apples. Because the prime vibration seems to be in fundamental energy units of electron volts, not mega electron volts of 10 to the power 6, and the speed of the light c as 12 to the power 6 units per cycle, not the 12 to the 6 times 10 to the 2 meters per second we're used to, we need to multiply the prime vibration masses by 10 squared to express them in mega electron volts per c squared, or equivalently multiply the probabilities by 10 to the power of 4. So, to summarize things, upper particle probability equals its amplitude times base 12 position times spin times 10 to the 4 conversion factor, and its mass equals the square root of that probability. Likewise, lower particle probability equals the square root of upper particle probability times lower particle spin, and its mass again equals square root of probability. The conversion factor not required here, as we've already converted in the correct units from the upper particle step. Here's a summary of all those calculations. As further details are provided in my book, we don't need to spend more time on them in this video. Regardless, the bottom line is that all the masses predicted by the prime vibration, highlighted in yellow, are extremely close to those measured experimentally, shown immediately below in green font. Now, the masses of the 3 boson particles, the Higgs, W, and Z, have similar geometric derivations from the prime vibration, the other 2 bosons, the photon and gluon, being massless. Because the Higgs, W, and Z represent interactions between pairs of particle positions, they can be depicted as rotations about the base 12 unit circle between those 2 points. In the case of the Higgs boson, those 2 points are the intersection between the 2 prime waves at position 6, which on the base 12 cycle spans the 4 positions at the bottom, or 120 degrees. As every particle position represents a spin vector spanning those 4 positions, the Higgs boson is essentially 2 vector arrows pointing directly at each other. And because the Higgs represents the ground state and mass potential for all particles, its probability is the entire area of that sector swept out by that full radius of 1, essentially a third of the circle, as shown shaded in gray. For the W boson, which can turn, say, a down quark into an up quark, The 2 points are 6 positions away from each other, or 180 degrees. But because the vector arrows of those 2 positions don't coincide as with the Higgs, it's the projected area between those 2 parallel vectors which defines its probability, and of that only the inner portion swept out by a radius of sine 60 degrees over 2, as that's the probability amplitude of the up and down quarks. As for the Z boson, which can turn a particle into its antiparticle, the 2 points are 360 degrees apart, and consequently at the same position on the base 12 circle, but basically on opposite sides, if you will. Now, seeing as the Higgs imparts mass to all particles, and that the W and Z are the only other bosons with mass, it would follow that the probability of the Higgs boson should equal the combined probabilities of the W and the Z. As such, the probability of the Z boson should just be the difference between the Higgs and the W boson, basically as shown. And since probability equals mass squared according to the prime vibration, the mass of the Higgs squared should likewise equal the W mass squared plus the Z mass squared, which is indeed what experimental evidence seems to show within a couple of percentage points, despite being considered a numerological coincidence more than anything else. Another even bigger coincidence is that the sum of the squared masses of the bosons seems to equal the sum of the squared masses of all the 12 fermions based on experimental measurements. But this appears to be predicted by our model too. We see here that the Higgs boson has a probability area equal to 1/3 of the entire base 12 cycle, as do the W and Z bosons combined, for a total area of 2/3 for all 3 bosons. And because the horizontal spin vector of position 6 represents the Higgs field at its unprojected ground state, the vertical vector of position 3 is its fully projected orientation and therefore represents the combined probabilities of all the fermion particles generated by that field. As that fully projected geometry spans 2/3 of the cycle, the boson probabilities must indeed equal the fermion probabilities, according to this theory. And because the prime vibration probabilities equal mass squared, that equivalence between bosons and fermions applies to their squared masses as well. Note that with the Schrödinger wave equation currently used in particle physics to determine probability, mass squared doesn't mean anything, so the significance of this equivalence has been understandably overlooked. Now that we've established the subatomic fractal, we can now move on to the atomic. The atom represents the first standalone fractal of the prime vibration, which I believe is why it has that characteristic 3D torus shape in the first place. As such, the prime vibration represents its front view as a probability structure, and the base 12 prime cycle its cross-section. Right away we see why the overall structure of the atom consists of electrons orbiting around a central nucleus. The electron being at position 0 keeps it at the perimeter, and its geometry as a point probability above the real axis creates a probability gap between it and the interior of the atom. Also note how its antiparticle, the positron, is located 12 positions away on the symmetrically opposite side of the prime vibration, as are all antiparticles from their matter counterparts. This allows the matter particles to manifest without being immediately annihilated by their evil antimatter twins. Note too how matter and antimatter being 12 positions apart on the prime vibration places them on the same position in the base 12 cycle, essentially 2 sides of the same coin. This further illustrates why matter and antimatter are created equally in maintaining neutrality overall, just like a perfectly fair coin toss. Likewise, between positions 5 and 7 is another probability gap, which creates a literal black hole in the center of the atom, which manifests as a spherical nucleus in 3D. This creates an energetically tough nuclear shell within which nothing can be seen, but which converges inwardly to the neutral intersection of position 6. This creates an extremely strong force at the shell itself, but which drops off rapidly towards its center, what I believe is responsible for the strong nuclear force, and what's called asymptotic freedom, the way particles within the nucleus are free to move until they encounter the shell. Between the outer electrons and the inner nucleus are positions 1 to 5. It's here where the geometry of each position determines how individual particles of matter combine into the composite particles of the nucleus, the proton and neutron. We begin with position 1, that of the individual up and down quarks as unbound particles. Next, at position 2, the +2 to -1 geometry requires 2 of the +2/3 charged up quarks to combine with 1 -1/3 charged down quark, forming the proton with a net +1 charge. Then, the +1 to -1 geometry of position 3 requires the +1 charged proton to combine with a -1 charge, of which only the electron is available. Because position 3 now has the same neutral charge as position 6, it creates the hydrogen atom with a central nucleus containing 1 proton orbited by 1 electron. This would explain why hydrogen is the simplest atomic structure upon which everything else is built, and why atomic structure itself is made from the up quark, down quark, and electron. Note too how it's only at the prime positions of 1, 5, 7, and 11 that the probability geometry falls directly on the neutral real axis, and thus stable particles of matter will manifest there most easily, which includes the up and down quarks at 1 and 7 on the solid wave of matter, and their antiparticles at 11 and 5 on the dashed antimatter wave. Now on to position 4, where the +1 to -2 geometry calls for 1 +2/3 charged up quark to combine with 2 -1/3 charged down quarks, creating the neutron with a net 0 charge. Because it has 0 charge, the neutron can easily join the +1 charged proton in the nucleus without being repelled by the electromagnetic force. The other half of the prime vibration from position 7 to 12 represents the antimatter portion of which the antiatom is produced, only running in reverse from 12 to 7. Again, just as all subatomic particles come in both matter and antimatter versions, so too do atoms and their constituent protons and neutrons, which the prime vibration does agree with. Now that we've deduced atomic structure and what holds the atom together, the electromagnetic force, and its nucleus together, the strong nuclear force, there's another known force that can turn particles into a different type. This is called the weak nuclear force, and it works in 2 main ways. One is by removing or adding a -1 unit of charge, called the W- and the W+ boson, to change a quark into its oppositely charged partner, such as turning a down quark into an up, which is how neutrons turn into protons in radioactive decay, by the way. The other way is by turning a particle into its antiparticle through a neutral boson called the Z, as discussed earlier. Because the W boson carries a minus or +1 charge, it represents a 180-degree rotation on the base 12 cycle. Again, because I² = -1 on the complex unit circle, which in turn represents a 6-position move along the prime vibration. As the prime vibration does require quark pairs to be 6 positions apart, the W boson is indeed predicted. Likewise, the Z boson represents a full 360-degree rotation on the base 12 cycle and complex unit circle, essentially returning it to where it started, which is why it has no charge. As the prime vibration requires matter and antimatter to be 12 positions apart, the Z boson is therefore correctly predicted too. Now, when we consider how the prime vibration is able to describe all the seemingly different forces in terms of its geometry and is an electromagnetic waveform itself, all of the forces seem to be just different localized aspects of electromagnetism. That is, what we call the electromagnetic force, and the photon as its carrier boson, is its behavior outside of the nucleus. The strong nuclear force, and the gluon as its boson, is its localized effect within the nucleus, between positions 5 and 7, and the weak nuclear force of the W and Z bosons is essentially its harmonic effect between any positions 6 or 12 positions apart. Also, all of these bosons are known to have a spin of 1, essentially meaning it only takes one 360-degree rotation to return to their starting orientation. And unlike the fermions, which represent individual positions on the figure-8 boundary of the prime vibration, and thus a spin of 1/2, meaning two 360-degree laps, the spin 1 force particles represent interactions between both the upper and lower boundaries, and are therefore not subject to the twisting spin of the individual particles themselves. Now I've waited until now to discuss the final remaining force not yet discussed, the elephant in the room called gravity. Although gravity is the force we are most familiar with in daily life, it is also the least understood in physics. It only seems to come into play at the macroscopic scale of big stuff, but is indetectable at the quantum scale. In fact, it represents the main nagging disconnect between relativity theory and quantum theory, where space-time describes it well in terms of the bending of space-time, but quantum mechanics can't seem to account for it. However, the prime vibration puts a new spin on gravity quite literally. To cut to the chase, the prime vibration suggests that gravity is simply its spin, its angular momentum, essentially the direction of the little blue arrow on each of the 12 increments of the base 12 cycle. But because we only perceive the projected front view of that spin into the page, so to speak, we feel its downward effect most where that blue arrow is pointing directly at the real axis, that is, at positions 3 and 9. It is only at those two positions that the full height of the spin vector comes into view, and its full vertical effect is therefore felt by any particles of matter occurring at those positions. And because it's only at position 3 that neutral atoms form, and anti-atoms at position 9, all matter consisting of atoms, which is everything, will experience the familiar downward type of gravity. All other positions have a less direct angle of spin, and therefore less force will be directed downward and more into or out of the page, basically inducing a horizontal rotation such as that which occurs with planets, stars, and spiral galaxies. On that note, let's now zoom out to the stellar scale to see how the prime vibration performs on a much bigger scale. Now, just as the subatomic particles are the fundamental building blocks of atoms, atoms are the building blocks of stars. However, unlike atoms, which achieve their neutral stability at position 3 out of an assembly of polarized subatomic pieces, the up and down quarks and the electron, stars already have complete atoms to work with. As such, stars begin at position 0 as an indistinct cloud of gas atoms, molecules, and dust in the extreme cold of space. Because there's no downward spin, the cloud does not yet coalesce together through gravity. This starts to happen at position 1, where the spin direction is now partly downward, but also starts to rotate due to the mostly lateral spin. This creates a dense ball of gas called a prestellar core. At position 2, the downward gravity further increases as the lateral gravity decreases, forming a rotating disk around the central core with polarized jets extending out of the poles to eject excess material not needed for the process. This rotating structure is called a protostar and embodies the polarized geometry of position 2. Then, at position 3, the spin direction is fully downward, which compacts and heats the core enough to turn hydrogen into helium and to ignite the star. Any remaining disk material then coalesces together into planets orbiting the star, forming a solar system such as our own. Then, as the star consumes its fuel, it moves on to position 4, where its spin is more lateral than downward now. For a smaller star such as our Sun, it sheds its outer layers as a red giant, leaving behind a very dense core of carbon as a white dwarf that cools without any source of heat. For stars much larger than the Sun, the dense core continues to compress, turning carbon to heavier elements and eventually to iron. Without any outward heat to resist gravity, the iron core continues to collapse into a supernova explosion, leaving behind either a superdense, quickly rotating neutron star, the +1-2 recipe of the neutron at position 4 itself, or further collapses into a black hole, that is, the start of the probability gap at position 5, where everything beyond that event horizon is therefore hidden, and according to the prime vibration, strictly antimatter from position 5 to 6. Then, as with the atomic cycle, this remaining antimatter passes through the polarity reversal of position 6 to become seed material of the next stellar cycle from positions 12 to 7, only this time in the antimatter probability space rather than that of matter. Once again, matter-antimatter symmetry and neutrality is maintained over the entire prime vibration cycle, but does so in an asymmetric way within each half cycle. Spoiler alert, this I suggest is why there is an excess of matter in the universe. The ending antimatter of each previous universe is the starting seed matter for the next. Now, onto the galactic scale, where, just as atoms were the building blocks of stars, stars are the building blocks of galaxies. Here, at this scale, we see the rotating torus shape of the prime vibration in plain view, complete with central black hole. And the galactic cycle proceeds very much like the stellar cycle. It starts at position 0 with a random expanse of individual stars coalescing together at position 1 into a rotating cluster, forms a distinct rotating disk with polar jets at position 2, and then a stable, mature galaxy at position 3, where the birth of new stars replenishes those which die. Then onto position 4, where its star-generating fuel runs out and the galaxy itself slowly dies, its remnants being consumed by the black hole at position 5 as antimatter. That ending antimatter then seeds the next galaxy cycle from positions 12 to 7. Now, the biggest prevailing mystery regarding galaxies, particularly spiral ones, is how they maintain their shape and motion like a rotating disk of constant speed without the outermost stars jettisoning off through centrifugal force. The current placeholder theory to account for this is called dark matter, an invisible type of matter that gravitationally holds the physical matter together in this peculiar way. However, the prime vibration seems to debunk this idea, suggesting there is no extra matter, dark or otherwise, but simply the tapered gravitational effect of the extra-dimensional spin or angular momentum into the page. This is the same tapered effect at the stellar scale that causes a gas cloud to go from mostly rotation to a protostar of mostly downward gravity to a stable star of strictly downward gravity, and then back again to a quickly rotating white dwarf or neutron star, and finally to the intense inward gravity of a rapidly spinning black hole. So, in the case of a galaxy, the rotational effect is most pronounced and downward gravity the least at its perimeter and at its center, where the blue spin arrows of positions 0 and 6 point into and out of the page. Likewise, the rotational gravity is least and downward gravity the most at the central bulge halfway in, at position 3, where the blue spin arrow is strictly downward. This would therefore explain not only what boosts the rotation of perimeter stars without flying off, but also why most of the stars bulge together halfway in, like the characteristic torus donut shape. Another curious pattern exhibited by large-scale clusters of galaxies is their tendency to align into a highly interconnected filament-like network, much like the neurons and synapses of a human brain. I suspect this is simply due to the base 12 prime cycle itself being a similarly interconnected network of nodes and connections. Both represent the intricate communication network typical of intelligent informational systems. We now reach what is presumably the largest fractal of the prime vibration, that of the entire universe. As with all the smaller fractals within, the universe consists of a dual universe cycle, each half cycle opposite in polarity to the other in terms of probability, and one feeding the next. However, as this universal fractal is a structure of space-time itself, it is the frame of reference within which we experience space and time. As such, we go along for the ride, so to speak, within this construct, unaware that our entire frame of reference is rotating within the twisting geometry of the prime vibration. So let's walk through the universe cycle to see how this plays out. First, we begin at position 0, the geometry of which seems to be a point probability, a seeming singularity from which space-time emerges. However, it is actually just the edge view of that probability space, the spin orientation of the little blue arrow horizontal and hidden from view. Then, from position 0 to 1, the spatial plane suddenly rotates into view from horizontal to slightly tilted downward. This would appear to us from our front view perspective as a sudden big bang of rapidly inflating space from a point origin. Also, as the ending antimatter of the previous half cycle becomes the starting matter of this one, all of that matter would be hypercompressed and would emerge with incredible energy and heat, which accurately characterizes the Big Bang as we know it. As the spin arrow is now partly down at position 1 and touching the real axis, this is also where conventional downward gravity would first emerge, along with the first matter in the form of individual quarks and leptons. Next, from position 1 to 2, the spin angle rotates even more downward, the force of downward gravity intensifying, but the rate of expansion of space decelerating. This is because the probability window between the upper and lower prime waves grows less quickly from 1 to 2 as it did from 0 to 1, as does any basic sine wave. Although this appears to us as a decelerating expansion of static space in a linear way, it's actually just the undulating 2D projection of space rotating in 3D. And because of the 2-to-1 geometry at position 2, it is here where the full polarity of electromagnetism emerges, and where protons and neutrons can form as a still hot ionized plasma, not yet cool enough to form stable hydrogen atoms. Then we go from position 2 to 3, characterized by the balance +1 to -1 geometry of polarity in neutral balance of stable atoms, stars, and galaxies. With the spin arrow fully downward now, the full effect of downward gravity is felt, and the spatial plane fully projected. This is therefore where space is at its maximum size and the coolest, and its expansion is halted, making this the ideal stable conditions for life to emerge. Speaking of which, the scale of complex biological life of living cells happens to occur at the geometric mean between the smallest and largest scales of nature. The Planck length of 10 to the minus 35 meters, the smallest size theoretically possible, and the Hubble length of 10 to the 26, the size of the observable universe. But why is that? Well, the geometric mean of a series of n numbers is the nth root of the product of those numbers, and represents the central number in a geometric progression, basically. As the positional scale of our universe cycle from 12 to the 0 to 12 to the 6 is such a geometric progression, we find that the seventh root of the product of those 7 numbers is indeed 12 to the 3. As such, life occurs precisely where the prime vibration says it should, the Goldilocks zone of position 3. Perhaps it's no coincidence then that the Earth, the only habitable planet in our solar system conducive to life, is also the third planet from the Sun. And while we're on the topic of life, why is it that DNA, the genetic blueprint for life itself, is a double helix structure just like the prime vibration? I suggest it's because the DNA molecule is yet another fractal of the prime vibration. It not only consists of 10 to the 11 atoms, the required particle density for the prime vibration to emerge, but DNA also precisely follows the 1, 5, 7, and 11 prime number geometry upon which the prime vibration is based. That is, just as the 1 and 7 prime positions combine to create one prime wave, and the 5 and 11 positions create the other, the 4 bases of DNA work the same way as 2 base pairs, always a longer base with a shorter one, and always with the same pairings of AT and GC, to use their initials. This creates the characteristic two-stranded asymmetric spiral structure with a constant spacing between strands, but running in opposite sequence, just like the prime vibration. Something else worth noting is that once the dense plasma of position 2 had combined into hydrogen atoms at position 3, space became transparent enough for the first light to pass through. This would in turn explain the cosmic microwave background, or CMB, that we can still perceive as the afterglow from that formative stage. Now, on to position 4, where the spin angle starts to rotate back into the page, so to speak, causing the probability window of space to contract and at an accelerating rate. However, this rotational acceleration inward would appear to us as linear acceleration outward, as measured by the redshift of light seemingly moving away from us, something which appeared to occur approximately 5 million years ago, where the expansion of space seemed to go from decelerating expansion to accelerating expansion. This, I suggest, is the true nature of dark energy, the placeholder name given to the seemingly invisible force causing space to seemingly expand. So, just as there's no mysterious dark matter, there's no dark energy either, just the deceptive effect of space-time rotating causing gravity and light to do so as well. This, by the way, also suggests where we currently are in our universe cycle. If the expansion to contraction transition point of position 3 happened 5 million years ago, as it's estimated to have occurred, that puts us just past position 3. And based on how fully materialized the universe is with stars and galaxies, and with the creation of new ones apparently in decline, this seems to make sense. This might also explain why we perceive the speed of light as being slightly faster, 0.4% faster, than that predicted by the prime vibration as touched on earlier. Because position 3 represents the space-time plane fully projected without distortion, it would be from that perspective that the true 12 to the 6 based speed of light would be measured accurately. So, if we are indeed slightly past position 3, the apparent speed of light is perhaps being distorted by the rotational contraction we are now experiencing, which would explain the actual number for the speed of light. Now, gravity being less at position 4, but contraction heating things up, would cause all stable matter to deconstruct back into loose protons and neutrons. Yes, that would mean curtains for us too, but only physically, not consciously, if this prime vibration theory is correct. And on that bittersweet note, we then move on to even faster contraction at position 5, and its singularly polarized geometry, where all matter returns to a hot plasma state of singular subatomic particles. And finally, from position 5 to 6 is the rapid deflation of space to the polarity reversal of 6, compressing all remaining antimatter in a big crunch to emerge out the other side as the starting matter for the next universe cycle, a reverse cycle that starts with another big bang at position 12 and ends with another big crunch at position 7. And if the universe indeed works this way, as eternally repeating cycles of polarized universe pairs through position 6, and which together form a torus of all possible cycles, this suggests a torus-shaped multiverse, a multiverse which possesses the same self-aware dynamic as every lower fractal of the prime vibration, and is therefore conscious of all experiences at all scales. And most important, it's the vibrational geometry and perspective of love at position 6, through which that consciousness expands. And well, there you have it, my admittedly unconventional theory of everything, which started from the simplest of all premises: how would reality emerge in the simplest and most logical way? But despite its simple basis, it provides a surprisingly comprehensive picture of reality at all scales of nature, and offers possible answers to that big list of open questions we started with. And I'm not saying that the prime vibration theory is that full picture by any means, but it does seem to offer a lot of tantalizing clues as to why the universe is the way it is, and why consciousness seems so fundamental to it all. At the very least, it offers a new way of looking at things through the ancient lens of base 12, a highly underestimated number system, which I believe will open a lot of doors to discovery, both scientific and personal. If you're interested in learning more about the prime vibration and my ongoing obsession with it, check out my book of the same name, available through all major online retailers, and my website, michaelsmith12.com. Thanks so much for watching.